Hello, and welcome to the World Cities Summit Smart Cities Workshop, sponsored by City Possible. I'm Maddie Callis, and I'll be moderating the session on the future of cities today, featuring Miguel Gamino, the Executive Vice President of Global Cities Enterprise Partnerships at Mastercard, and Greg Clark, the Group Advisor of Future Cities and New Industries at HSBC, and who usually chairs the World City Summit Mayors Forum. We all wish we were in person with you, but for now, we'll continue in this digital role. As we all may imagine, COVID-19 has drastically changed lives over the past year. And as the pandemic slowly winds down, what changes will global cities face permanently? So as we dive into the discussion today, I'd like to start with Miguel. I think cities are at a critical inflection point. Climate adaptation, access and affordability, economic growth, infrastructure, and public health are among the many layered challenges that cities are facing today. How has COVID-19 impacted the landscape of cities?
Thanks, Maddie, and good to see you, Greg. And always enjoy an opportunity to talk about these things, especially in kind of the World Cities Summit context, with so many people thinking about how to address some of these challenges I think we're going to talk about today. So thank you very much. I think that it's pretty clear that COVID, this global pandemic, has impacted cities pretty dramatically. I mean, we saw things that were kind of pre-existing conditions, if you will, that just got exacerbated. Things like the inequities within cities, economically and otherwise. The healthcare systems that were even more stressed during this global pandemic. And even the ideas of urban migration, right? We had for many moons, if you will, people like Greg and I would often refer to the same statistics of urban migration patterns. And I think we saw some of those kind of foregone conclusions of urban migration shift a bit. And I think it's causing us to reflect a bit deeper on how people are really moving around the urban landscape, impacted by COVID, or again, just simply accelerated by it. And then public infrastructure, having to rethink things like public transportation, and even just the commercial infrastructure, small business and local economies, and the impact that has on the people who make their livelihood owning those small businesses, but then also the government itself being impacted with its own tax revenue impacts for economies that have been shut down. And how do they continue to deliver critical service when those revenue streams are impacted? And how do we make sure, probably most importantly, that we come back from all of this in a stronger and more inclusive way? How do we make sure that small businesses don't just come back, but come back stronger and are in a better position to withstand any sort of disruption in the future? And so I think, thinking about those layers and the complexity that means for policymakers, even public investment decisions, and how people are receiving and living in their cities in this new reality is absolutely critical. And there's a bunch of statistics that we can kind of recite during the course of the conversation, but from a big picture perspective, those are the realities I think that our colleagues and friends running cities around the world are really faced with. How do you balance keeping people safe from a public health perspective and keeping them safe from an economic and well-being perspective? That is the principal, I think, dilemma that many cities are facing.
Thanks, Miguel. And I think you've pointed out how a lot of the existing inequities have been exacerbated through COVID-19 and problems that existed pre-pandemic. And I think, Greg, that gives you a great opportunity to weigh in. And we know urbanization has been a dominating force since the end of World War II. And how has the rapid transformation to hybrid and remote work as a result of the pandemic brought about many questions that cities need to address and how they design their their downtowns and their offices? And do you have any initial thoughts or data that we can expect in terms of long-term growth of cities?
Well, Maddie, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you and Miguel. It's always a pleasure to work with Mastercard, with City Possible, and of course, with the World City Summit as well. So really delighted to be here. And I think Miguel's already set out some of the big picture here. And I was fascinated really by what he said. When you stop and think about the scale of the change that's been going on in the last year and a half, it really is kind of history in the making. So the way I would see this is to say, yes, there are very, very big questions now confronting cities. But I would also say that cities have proven over time to be highly adaptive. So, you know, the way I think about this is a century of cities from 1980 to 2080, the world's population moving from roughly 40% living in cities to roughly 80% living in cities, human population trebling in size at the same time. So basically, we're moving to a situation where many, many more people are going to be living in cities. And there seems to be a kind of optimal point for any continent. And if you take North America, where 5% of the world's population live, 80% are in cities. Latin America, about 80% as well. That's 8.5% of the world's population. Europe, we've got 10% of the world's population, 80% there. These regions in the world where urbanization, we're already at kind of full urbanization, which is 80%. They've been experiencing, I think, a slightly different set of changes from other regions of the world where urbanization may be at 30, 40, 50, 60, 70%. In other words, there's a natural process of urbanization completing itself going on here, and you've got this COVID intervention happening. So I think Miguel's already said it, but what does COVID do in this? It's a big digital accelerator, and it requires cities to adjust. It means that there's a different relationship between the physical role of cities and the digital role of cities. And this leads to some new trends. Miguel's already mentioned them. Hybrid working seems to me to be one of them. The acceleration of the demise of physical retail seems to be another. A third one, of course, is a lower level of travel into and between cities at the moment because of all of the restrictions. And if you like, what all of this leads to is a kind of switching effect. I think that cities in the end, in a general way, are switching out of corporates, commuters, and consumption, and switching into innovation, experience, and habitat as kind of three big ideas about the future. But I do think that these trends, which have all sorts of implications for transport and land use, which we'll come on to, there are some quite big variables. So one big variable, of course, is the industrial structure of cities. Some cities specialize more in economic activities which can be easily digitized. Other cities specialize less in those things. And so the degree of exposure to the digitization process of industry has a big effect on how much cities are changing. The second one, I think, is what are the dominant modes of mobility and land uses in the cities. For cities that are very dependent on public transport and have a kind of compact urban model, those cities, I think, are seeing a return to something like their pre-pandemic activities. I've been tracking 100 cities around the world. If you take Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, just to mention three, when they come out of their lockdown, they return very quickly to older models. Whereas if you compare that with cities where there's more of a use of private car, less of a compact urban form, perhaps more spread out, what we're seeing is that there's more change happening in those places as people make more choices. And then the third big one, I think, is to do with the degree of urbanization that I just spoke about. If you like, the amount of social capital or place capital that the cities have, how compelling are the cities as places to be, seems to have an effect. So I don't think we'll be seeing the same patterns happening everywhere, but I do think we're going to see these broad trends playing out in slightly different ways in different places.
That's really interesting, Greg. And I'm wondering if I can ask you to go a little deeper first on the future of work and how it will impact the cities and the ways we utilize space. You know, how can cities look to build this infrastructure of the future in the hybrid models?
It's a very interesting question, Maddie. And of course, it depends a little bit on what kinds of sectors the city is specializing in. But clearly, one big set of changes here are to do with, how technology is changing the way we manage the physical space. So if you think about prop tech, plan tech, infra tech, urban tech, all of these new digital platforms emerging to enable us to manage spaces and services and the interaction between different infrastructures well together. That's obviously a very important set of changes. A second one is to do with workspaces. If you're sifting, as it were, and sorting between the things you really need to do in an office versus the things that you can do anywhere mobile, if you're in an industry that's got a digitizable job, then of course offices are going to be reconfigured towards the collaborative, the creative, the confidential, the training, the development of people, the building of corporate identity and brand. Offices will feel more like places that we're going to do the creative parts of our work, and the work that is more routine or can be done in a more distant digital way will be done wherever we want to do it. So a big reconfiguration of offices and a shift in the way they're organized. And possibly we'll also see some other workplaces like factories moving into cities, because the more we're able to decarbonize the production process, the more factories become clean and green, the less necessary it will be to separate their locations from places of habitat, places of residence, places of work. So we might see a new kind of super mixity in our cities coming about because of some of these changes. And then you mentioned infrastructure. I think what we're going to see is a big demand for new infrastructure, particularly for deepening digital infrastructure, but also we'll see a demand for logistics, transport, and other kinds of infrastructure to serve this new digital economy. It's a rather obvious point that just as the physical economy creates digital opportunities, the digital economy also creates physical opportunities. Click and collect, fulfillment centers, dark kitchens, all of these other new land uses that are associated with digitization are actually new kinds of infrastructures that cities need to prioritize. And that's not to mention, of course, data centers and so much more. So the digital economy has physical consequences that cities also have to manage.
Yes, that's a very good point. I'm thinking, even as I have a digital job, I still have to live somewhere. And Miguel, I think I'd love to ask your opinion more broadly. Where do you see the opportunity for digital innovation in city centers? And then how will that impact the built environment where we live, work, play, travel? And any thoughts on what impacts that will have on real estate development and mobility?
So I do think that it's important, as Greg laid out, that there are those jobs and skill sets that lend themselves to industries that lend themselves to kind of the digital alternative, and there are a bunch that don't, right? There is also, I think, a third category of job creation that is physical, but driven by digitization. And the most simple example is what Greg mentioned, fulfillment centers. Well, someone's got to, just because you don't go to the store to buy something, AKA you order it online, it still has to physically get to you somehow. And that means logistics, and that means, someone ultimately delivering it to your doorstep. And so I do think that there will be this need to think about fulfillment and logistics broadly across the built environment. And frankly, this goes back pre-COVID. Even when I was still CTO in New York City, we were having conversations about the built environment in the new kind of Amazon world, right? Where people were buying things and having them delivered. And I was living in a brand new building that had a package room, if you will, but was, woefully inadequate to handle the volume of packages, because while they had planned for that sort of thing, they didn't anticipate the volume, the growth at, the scale of it, and how people would use it for all sorts of things. So I think the challenge for the built environment is to find ways to be flexible, quite frankly, because you build roads and bridges and buildings to last 100 years, and the innovation happens in every 100 days or less, right? And so that, I think, is the principal challenge. If I were an architect or in that world, the thing that would keep me up at night is how rigid the built environment is by physics and the nature of what it is, versus how dynamic consumer behaviors and expectations and residents and workers, how dynamic their needs are and how fast that changes. So I think flexibility is probably the most important element there, because we don't know how things are going to play out next. I do think that it's a huge opportunity, frankly, for what I was saying kind of in my first remarks, and some of what Greg has reiterated, is that this we refer to cities categorically, and I think that we're going to be forced, at least those of us that nerd out on this, are going to be forced to think more nuanced about one city versus another, right? Large, dense, established and relatively expensive cities are experiencing a different impact than smaller, up and coming, kind of the new wave of boomtown cities, in part, I think, because of that flexibility, and the cost nature. And so I think people are finding the flexibility in their day jobs, those that can go digital, and making different choices with where they do that work from. But then again, that drives a whole different category of workforce needs, because as people move to these other, let's call them smaller metro areas, because I can do my work from there more comfortably, or whatever my value proposition is. But now I'm ordering Amazon or other things. And so now that kind of follow-on infrastructure has to happen pretty quickly, both the built environment and the people necessary to support that. Because if it doesn't, then my lifestyle expectations aren't met, then I might make a different choice, right? And so I think that's the opportunity for kind of the recipients of kind of new residents and workforce in these cities. They need to think very carefully about how to capture the moment, because ultimately people still have that flexibility. They can go back to their original city. They could go off onto a different one if their needs and expectations aren't met. I think that the way that land use is thought about is going to continue to change. I think a lot more, we talk about the principle of public-private partnerships, and interesting partnerships all the time in the context of City Possible. This is no different, right? I think it's more important than ever that real estate developers, the built environment designers, and the urban planners, and the policymakers, and the technology innovators that are kind of influencing these changing needs, coordinate and collaborate, because if not, then we're at risk to make some 100-year decisions that won't that won't serve the needs of people 100 days from now. So I think that's an opportunity for better partnerships to drive different outcomes. I think even the monetization of land use in cities, I think, will have to be thought about carefully. Yeah, I've said this again, going back pre-COVID, but exacerbated by it. There may be less need for street parking meters, and more need for curbside drop-offs in some of these future. And so that's just one example of kind of an approach to to the policy making and thinking about it as an opportunity that I think is in front of some of these decision makers in the urban planning environment, right? Could they capture those moments for the benefit of their local communities? So I think those are just a couple of examples, I think. But more than anything, I do believe that this, I won't even call it remote work, but flexibility of work location is going to continue. I think people have made investments in their infrastructure and their education equally to get comfortable with doing things like exactly what we're doing here today, doing an important discussion that we previously would have done in person, probably finding ways to be effective in our communication and our relationships digitally. That opens up a bunch of different opportunities for us to get together while the three of us are all on different continents, perhaps. So I think that we just have to think about that reality and that as an opportunity, and find ways to make those opportunities accessible to as many people as possible, and to think inclusively about the non-digital workforce impacts of the digital workforce changes, right? Think about it holistically and inclusively, that the people who still are putting hands on products and have that sort of role in this changing economy, that they have to be considered too.
I think Miguel, you bring up a lot of great points that all deserve kind of going deeper into. But I think I'd like to toss it back to you, Greg, for just kind of the highlights. Given all the challenges that Miguel mentioned, what will leaders need to keep in mind and prioritize as they're thinking of how they develop their cities, how they plan their budgets, and in terms of spending to retain residents, attract industries, and really make their city the city of the future in 50 years from now?
Yeah, I was also mesmerized by what Miguel just said, because there's so much in it, and I particularly like what Miguel said about kind of 100-year infrastructures, but working now with cycles of development that are so short that you have to avoid lock-in, but on the other hand you have to make wise decisions. I think, Miguel, you're absolutely right. On this bigger question, Maddie, I think it's hard to give you a comprehensive answer, but what I would say is, like in so many things, cities will be in competition with one another to try to make the most of the opportunities and the options that Miguel has just described. And we know that one of the dynamic of cities is that they're highly collaborative. Cities like to network, they like to be members of City Possible, they like to learn together, but they also have to compete for jobs, for capital investment, for population. They have to compete for airtime. They have to compete for transfer payments from either federal governments or state governments or multilateral organizations. So there is this element of competition. And I guess that what that means for many cities now is that they have to get really good at the reconfiguration process that Miguel's been talking about. So there's a reconfiguration in terms of what kind of jobs and urban economy they're trying to host and trying to serve, what kind of population they need to serve that. They need to think about how to reconfigure land uses, logistics, and infrastructure to make it more appropriate. And also, I think a very strong focus coming out of this pandemic on the kind of ethical side of the city. How quickly are they pursuing decarbonization? What's their agenda around diversity and inclusion? How are they creating a place that's healthy and safe for everyone who wants to live there? So all of these issues, I think, are going to be part of the kind of post-pandemic competition. And then you've got the issue that you've just raised, which is really about how do you finance this? And I think for many city governments, what we're seeing here is a big switch, particularly for city governments that are dependent upon local revenues, which of course is not all city governments. City governments in the US are uniquely, I think, highly dependent on local revenues. In other parts of the world, there's a mix between locally generated revenues and transfer payments that come from higher tiers of government. And of course, the more dependent you are on local revenues, the more the strength of your local economy matters. The more you're dependent on transfer payments, the more it's about national policy and how that matters to you. But in all of these things, I think we're going to see a very challenging next 5 years, but hopefully some innovation coming out of it. So for example, new sources of revenue will be a big issue. I think just as Miguel says, we'll need less roadside parking, but we might need more roadside logistics. Paying for that and turning that into a revenue mechanism will be key. Just as we're trying to reduce the carbon emissions in cities, paying for pollution, paying for congestion, some kind of road user charging is more likely to be used. Just as we have people who don't live in the city anymore because they've decided to relocate, but they still have a job that's based in the city, how will employment taxes work in that context? So these are just some examples. I think there's going to be some big innovations in what I would call municipal revenues. We'll also see cities, I think, trying to manage and optimize their assets and their infrastructures differently, much more scope for blended finance, public and private coming together. But also, I think, very new investment models emerging in things like energy and utilities, space, transit, other kinds of things, some new hybrids between public and private finance, civic finance as well. So it's a very, very, very big agenda in terms of the future of urban economies, the competition between cities, the ability to mobilize capital and to invest. And there's also some new, very difficult geographies here. So larger regions where, if you like, in the old days, we thought of a region as being a travel to work area where you had to travel on the surface. Actually, if you're living in a place that's 2,000 miles away from where your job is, and you're commuting twice a month using an aeroplane just to be there, it changes the notion of region. Housing markets and labor markets now have a new geography, so that's a complexity. More corridors, more key interactions between certain places. People who have a job in one city but live in another place, those corridors will become important and they'll be sources of revenue. And then I think cities will pay greater attention to what we might call virtual citizens, people who participate in the life of the city but don't actually live there much of the time. So if you like, we'll have kind of temporary residents or fractional residents or part-time residents. How city governments engage with them is going to be very, very important. So it's a big topic, but I think those are some of the big issues that are going to emerge over this next cycle. I'm not saying these are all happening tomorrow, but I think they're all happening in the next 10 years.
Can I ask you, Greg, particularly through your role as the advisor to the future of cities at HSBC, how does a multinational financial institution like HSBC think about what city developments to prioritize and finance as we move into this new area? And does it have the teams you work with thinking about any primarily transportation or sustainable infrastructure or urban parks? Any insights I think would be fascinating to the audience.
Okay, well, again, it's a very big topic, but for a bank like ours, that's in 67 countries, 300 cities, and it's in the countries, if you like, where the highest level of kind of global exposure exists, because the bank has a real DNA in the kind of trade and cross-border investment, cross-border people movements, those kinds of things. So I think all cities are engaging simultaneously in recovery, in reconfiguration, and in decarbonization. And each of those three things offers opportunities for investment. They each bring investment needs. So, for example, some of the investments need to be very much in changing the economic framework of the city. Some of the investment needs to be in the quality of housing and the healthy environment of the city. Some of it needs to be very big systems change, like energy infrastructure, logistics, those kinds of things. But other parts of it are to do with digital infrastructures. And I think Miguel made this point earlier on. I also think there's a lot of investment requirement in skills, knowledge, education, aptitudes, enterprise, the ability of these economies to generate jobs. And the ability of cities to optimize the non-financial tools like land use planning or their own physical assets and how they use that to generate revenues are important. But for the bank, what this really means is that we're trying to directly finance cities where they want to make these transitions, but we're also trying to indirectly finance them. And a lot of what our bank does is to finance national governments, state-owned enterprises, development finance institutions, and others, many of which are engaging directly in this transition, but also, of course, corporates. Many of the corporates that run the energy, the water, the transport, the infrastructure, the port, the freight systems in cities, these are the big clients of our bank. So we're indirectly financing this transition through them. And the key thing for us is really a commitment in three areas. Firstly, in decarbonization, where we've put $1 trillion on the table to do more in this space. Secondly, on new green technologies, where we've put 100 million there to try to really accelerate the process of change. And then thirdly, and in a sense, most importantly, investing in the new productive industries and enterprises of the future so that cities can grow this economy. So our bank makes a commitment to all of its clients to help them move from where they are to where they need to be. And in many cases, that's a journey of decarbonization, of digitization, of finding new business and operational models. And we work through our clients to really have an impact on the city. So that's a very general statement of what we're up to. But I think that you will see increasingly that the revolution that's happening in sustainable finance will increasingly be a revolution that becomes a big focus of change in urban financing. Sustainable finance is the means to finance urban development in the future.
Thank you, Greg. Miguel, I'm just wondering if any of the insights Greg has shared about, I really particularly like recovery, reconfiguration, and decarbonization. Is that what you're hearing from the City Possible network in terms of how they're prioritizing? And if you could let us explain how Mastercard is partnering with some of the cities in the network to help understand and plan the shift to digital.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're certainly seeing an acceleration of the digital agenda, generally speaking. And what I have talked about pretty often is that all cities have had a digital agenda. It's typically been oriented, pre-COVID, it had been oriented around efficiencies and kind of optimization. Now it's driven by a need to deliver service in this new world of both remote work and people's expectations and concerns for contact and health and those sorts of things. So absolutely, the digital agenda in the city as a consumer of and user of the technology is one thing. The other is to expand on what Greg was sharing. Also, that scenario of someone who I think they refer to it as the super commuter, who might live 2,000 miles away from their place of employment and travel a couple times a quarter or whatever on an airplane. Well, that person is commuting to their job daily digitally. And I think we have to think about that infrastructure to some extent in that way, right? For this remote work to be sustainable, we have to also deploy sustainable connected infrastructure for those people to use. That also means that in some cities, the opportunity isn't just about your natural resource around you, right? Places where centers of industry, often because of what they had around them, manufacturing, mining, all sorts of things like that, because you had that raw material in your community. Well, now that raw material is more transportable, being just in some industries. Again, I want to be super clear. I'm not pretending like the whole world can go digital. But for that segment that can, all of a sudden you can create this local resource by making your community digitally connected, right? All of a sudden now you can house an information worker industry if you just can guarantee connectivity to that place of employment that's 2,000 miles away. So in some ways, those paradigms need to just be broken through as we think about the value proposition of digital. It's no longer just about shopping online. This work from remote is heavily dependent upon that. But also the trail on impacts or dependencies, I should say, are things like being able to access education and other things digitally too, to some extent. And then those local quality of life resources that are the analog versions of what makes people enjoy a community. So a lot of discussion about digital. Both of you know me. Most people probably know me well enough that I'm all in on it. I've been all about broadband as the pathway to prosperity for a decade or two. So for me to say this my point is it's significant. We have to also keep in mind that I think you said it, Maddie, like you still got to live somewhere, right? And we still are social beings and we still do want to interact with one another. And so I do think that we have to be careful that we rotate heavily, appropriately to make these digital investments and make digital access equitable. We also have to maintain thought about the reality of what it takes to deliver quality of life. And I think that that's what, again, I think we're dealing with a conflict of paradigms across the themes, and that is one of them. A city has to invest heavily in digital, but not forget that it has to continue to invest in the quality of life factors in their city. And we're seeing, I think, the smart leaders trying to figure that out, right? Thinking long and hard about digital equity and appointing new offices, to focus on that, but also investing in the small business community, the inclusive kind of outcomes that they're trying to deliver to people who are living in those communities in real life, if so to speak. So I think that those are some of the things. And Mastercard and City Possible, what we do, I think, well, is we organize and galvanize, if you will, the thought leaders around these topics so that we interrogate these questions better. And then we can bring assets to bear. Some of those, one of those principal assets are partnerships like the one with Greg and HSBC, where we can bring multiple players to the table who all have kind of different perspectives, but also have different assets and resources. I think that's going to be critically important as we are trying to navigate our way through this paradigm shift, that we do that as inclusively as possible in all aspects. And I think obviously, we have launched City Insights as a platform to help local governments rely on data so that they're making these decisions more objectively and more informed, as opposed to simply relying on instinct or intuition. And I think that's also going to be really important because the stakes are high, the cycles are short, and so mistakes that we make are going to impact lots of people, and but so will the good decisions. And so I think to the extent that we can increase our probability of hitting home runs by way of data and objectivity and diverse partners and deep discussion, I think cities as a whole will benefit. And I agree with Greg's point that they compete to some extent. I will say, Greg, I'm also on the record going back a decade or two that the superpower of cities is the ability to collaborate. We coined the phrase, so to speak, because I think they do compete in sport, and to some extent they compete in economic development. But I think that's even more diffused in this reality, right? Like, I don't think that cities are necessarily needing to compete for the corporate headquarters relocation the way that economic developers used to do, right? Now you're competing for this dispersed workforce. And so Mastercard might be in your city without a building and a logo on it downtown, right? Because by virtue of having a bunch of people who live there and work for the company, and now the company cares about that location by virtue of the fact that a bunch of our important asset being people live there and work there and play there. So I think there's also this interesting paradigm shift even on that front, where collaboration, I think, is going to win, right? The cities that can find ways to collectively make people want to be part of their communities, plural, they might be the ones that win, that create those corridors where people can live and work in multiple cities during the course of their year or their career. I think some cities that make alliances that way might find some interesting successes. So again, these are all thoughts. I think things that we're hearing from cities wanting to digitize their experience, create digital access to prosperity for their communities. But I think also trying to be smart and as informed and objective in that decision making and collaborative in those programs as possible.
Maddie, can I do a little follow-up on what Miguel's just said? Because
Yeah.
I think he said so many things that I find really fascinating. And I think, Miguel, I absolutely agree with you that in the end, the superpower of collaboration is the one that we really want to optimize. I think all I'm really saying is that under the surface as well, there's still some competition. And I think the competition now is much more about talent and people, and it's about amenities than it is about tax base or corporate presence and all of that. I think you're absolutely right. But one of the things I think that your brilliant explanation illuminates is the conversation that's been going on since the pandemic struck, which was really the idea that people were going to leave the big cities and move to the small cities. Well, of course, whether that happens to any degree depends upon the things that Miguel has just been describing. It depends upon the digital infrastructure. It depends upon the social capital. It depends upon the quality of place. It depends upon the attractiveness of neighborhoods. And one of the consequences of all of these changes might be that some big cities get bigger and attract more population. And some small cities might attract some population. Some small cities might lose population as well. So I don't think we're seeing a uniform shift from big cities to small cities being decisively accelerated here. I think it depends on all the things that Miguel just mentioned. Quality of life, quality of place, quality of local amenities and infrastructure. Do you want to raise your family here? Do you want to grow old here? Is this a place that supports a certain quality of life? And one of the things we might look back and say is that the pandemic gave people, at least some people, a new sense of having some choices about where they live, how they work, how they consume, when they travel, and what mode of transport they use. And that means that there's a kind of a new, as it were, premium on the quality of life that cities can offer, which I think is why I said, Maddie, right at the beginning, that I think cities are moving out of the business of supporting corporates, commuters, and consumers, and moving much more towards habitat, a place to live, innovation, something you can't do without face-to-face interaction, and experience, putting together not just consumption on its own, but the experience of the urban amenities, the experience of the lifestyle, the experience of being in a place where there's lots of other people. Cities now have to shift their focus to what cities are good at, not what any place can now do. And it seems to me that's the big change that Miguel's comments kind of point us towards.
I think also to add to that, Greg, I think, perhaps it is situational, right? I think a lot of people left New York, but that makes room for a lot of other people to come to New York. And there is something magical about that city in particular that I've experienced, that I think lots of people experience, and it's hard to describe unless you experience it. And the same with London and Singapore and so many other cities that I've had the pleasure of visiting and experiencing. I think my point is that perhaps it is the iTunes era of cities, where you no longer have to buy the whole record. You can buy the songs you like when you like them, listen to them when in the moment that they fit. And perhaps there is an element of that for cities, that New York has something special to offer. I might not need that every day, but some days I do. And the ability for some people, based on their job and other factors, some people will have the ability, the flexibility to experience or to consume the value proposition or the offering of a city based on when I need that experience, right? I guess it's a version of people who have the luxury of a vacation home to escape the heat in the summer or escape the brutal cold in the winter, what have you. It's just maybe an acceleration of that too, which is in the work setting, where you can get people together in a particular city to drive some energy around innovating a product or a topic, and then maybe in a more kind of daily task setting, maybe I am more productive in a different setting. So I think that, again, we're theorizing. We're pretty well informed theorists in this topic, but a lot of these things are TBD, right? A lot of these things are things that you and I kind of think might happen as we read the tea leaves. But I think a lot of this paradigm is still yet to be discovered. And I think from the innovation standpoint, I do think that the next industry unicorn, or industry of unicorns, if you will, we will look back and realize they had been invented in 2020 and 2021 around this. Cities will innovate. Cities will solve the problems. They've done it in previous pandemics that we've talked about before, that has driven, worldwide quality of life improvements, right? Sewer systems and things like that. I think that I don't think we know exactly what that is yet, because we're still living in that moment. But I do think that's going to come. Perhaps it's digital innovation that will be the digital equivalent of sewer systems that will change lives for people everywhere around the world over time. Maybe it's something else that you and I haven't seen yet, but I agree with your principles of that kind of the shift of focus. And I think that that's going to drive a lot of that innovation and those new outcomes.
Greg and Miguel, you both thought of such great ideas, and as you said, you're well-informed theorists, and we're kind of ideating on what the future of cities could be, the next unicorns, and I'm imagining myself as a city leader now, and I would be a little overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, I have to attract talent. I have to create these very livable, decarbonized, green, sustainable communities that are inclusive for all. So to get a little bit more tangible, what is a piece of advice that you would encourage a city leader to think about and focus on now as kind of a first step towards that new innovative future?
I think the table stakes are the infrastructure. I'll just mention a couple, these digital for all, broadband for all plans. They're more important now than ever before, right? And giving people access to the digital economy that Mastercard has been, on that mission and ambition for the better part of a decade or more. I think that those things are the table stakes that lead to these other kind of potential outcomes that we're talking about. That part that seems maybe intimidating or abstract. Those are the things that might come of it. But the first step, if I was a mayor, is make sure everyone in my community has access to this digital frontier full stop, because that's the equivalent of road systems in the industrial kind of revolution, right? Can you get from where you are to where the opportunity is? And that's why I refer to digital that way, because that's effectively what it is. So if I had to pick one thing to add to my priorities list, because they're still going to be focused on healthcare, picking up trash, you know, those things are not going to change in terms of the priorities of public decision makers. But the one thing I would really bump up on the list is access to digital infrastructure. Greg?
Well, I have to agree with Miguel. I think without digital infrastructure, almost nothing else that a city now needs to do is possible. But if we go back to the three things I was saying cities are in the business of now: habitat, experience, and innovation. There's very practical things to do there. Habitat is about livability. And as Miguel says very clearly, half of livability is about public services, collecting the trash, good schools. It's about nice parks. It's about a place where people want to raise families, a place where you want to grow old. So livability and the urban amenities that support it, including libraries and theaters and swimming pools and all this basic mundane urban amenities, are going to be very, very, very important, I think, in population retention and population attraction. And then in experience, this is about having the wow factor in our cities. It's about having places where you can do something that you simply can't do online. And that means places where you've got a unique combination of natural environment, public art, interactiveness with people you wouldn't otherwise bump into, huge crowds, but also small places where you can experience an oasis of calm. So that kind of experience economy of cities is going to be at a much higher premium, because the consumption economy of cities isn't really going to exist in the same way anymore. And then the last one is innovation. That's about how you create new sources of prosperity, and also about how you solve basic problems. So this is about making sure your scientific community, your creative community, your universities, your theaters are interacting as much as possible with your public authorities, with your large corporates. We don't need a whole story here about the innovation economy, but we know that the cities that produce the new jobs are the ones where the technical community, the corporate community, the creative community are working together in a very kind of fertile collaboration. I think those are the three things that city leaders need to do, as long as they've done what Miguel said, which is to really focus on the digital infrastructure and digital access, because none of these things will work if you don't have that.
Very fascinating insights, and I'm gonna push you all a little further, because as we're kind of summing up here, and there's been a lot of fascinating insights shared. Besides joining City Possible to really tap into the global superpower of collaboration network, and Greg, I'll start with you. Can you give one concise piece of advice to a city leader?
Well, let me just agree that joining City Possible is a very good idea for all city leaders. And, you know, Miguel and Maddie, I salute the work that you have done to create this fabulous network with more than 1,000 cities now involved in it in one way or another. And, you know, our world only has 10,000 cities, and we need those 10,000 cities to succeed if our planet is going to survive. And I don't think there's any alternative to well-run, well-led, digitally enabled, sustainable cities. That's the only way to accommodate a 10 billion person human race. So I don't see an alternative to that, and that's why City Possible has my absolute support. The practical thing, I guess, would be to recruit and encourage a positive view of all of the changes that Miguel and I have been describing. And one way to do that is to try to employ a person like Miguel And he's done it in 3 cities already. If I remember the CV correctly, Miguel, I think you've done it in, you've certainly done it in San Francisco and in New York. But every city needs somebody to be thinking about that city as a digital platform, not just that city as a municipal government or a physical place. And if you have somebody who's doing that, and if they have anything like the skills that Miguel has in this space, you're going to have cities that really know how to optimize this digital age to make it great for people, for place, and for planet as well. And I think that if there's one thing that you haven't done that you need to do, it's to have somebody who's really leading your digital agenda so that they can take the city into these processes of reform and change that Miguel has been describing.
Yeah, and I would, my response would be to add to that, having been in those roles, my specific follow-on advice to Greg's advice is to also prioritize it. The digital officer or technology officer or whatever you call this person or people should be, if you will, cabinet level, right? They like the digital agenda is not instead of the public health agenda or the public housing agenda or the public transportation agenda. It is to support all of those things. And so I think the investments in technology, the expectations of technology and digitization need to be prioritized. They need to be, if you don't have a digital agenda that is speaking to how it is supporting all those core public service, as Greg called them, amenities, quality of life realities, then it's missing the mark. It's missing the real goal of, or the value proposition, if you will, of the technology, is to drive improvements in all those parts of people's lives that matter, not necessarily as a separate insular agenda. So do what Greg said, but prioritize it to the top of the org chart, if you will, and have some courage to make those investments, because some of them may be unclear in the early days, but I think those that can, again, use data and objective kind of processes to inform those investments and decisions will minimize the risk. And minimize the chance of making the wrong decision, and if nothing else, will be quicker to identify when a wrong decision has been made. Right? If you're measuring in that objective way, in that data-driven way, the outcomes that you're pursuing, you're going to be quicker to identify the need to pivot or to make directional changes. So I think also the data element of things and the objectivity of some of these decisions is going to be super important, at least in the near term.
Well, thank you, Miguel. And I'd like to point out as well that some of the prioritizing and how to go digital, Greg, as you mentioned, if you're not connected to the City Possible Network, by all means, please reach out to myself, Greg, or Miguel, or one of the other contacts of our Mastercard Global Cities team. You've probably seen in our Smart City workshops here at World City Summit. We'd love to help get you resources. We have an online repository of playbooks, policies, and tools, as Miguel mentioned, in City Insights. Thank you so much for joining our session today, and please stay in touch. I think you'll see Miguel and Greg coming up together throughout the rest of 2021 at some other global events, potentially online for sure, and potentially in person. And hopefully we will see you all soon in person in the coming year. Thank you, and have a great rest of the Smart City Workshop at World City Summit.